Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar on the SOC Visibility Triad, which is a collaboration between Google Cloud and Corelight. I'm Greg Bell. I'm one of the co-founders at Corelight and Chief Strategy Officer. And today we have two eminent guests. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion, if not a feisty discussion. But first I want to give just a little background. If you've ever been to RSA, which I like to call the monster truck rally of our industry, you know what it means to be overwhelmed by thousands of vendors, hundreds of acronyms, and it's actually very hard for a human being, a human mind, to make sense of this complexity. As an industry, I think we need simplifying models, and today's topic is the SOC Triad, one of the best and actually one of the most durable of those models. We want to dig into the question of whether that model is still accurate. Is it still helpful? Is it still relevant? Does it need to be revised? Does it need to evolve? And before we start, a couple of points of order. This conversation is being recorded, and you'll be getting a link after the webinar. So I want to welcome everyone who's here either live or who's watching by video later. We will have, for those who are participating live, a Q&A session at the end. And actually, you can already submit questions anytime through the interface of GoToWebinar. So if during this discussion you have any questions at all, rather than just forgetting them, put them in the interface and we'll try to get to as many as we can as the discussion unfolds. Now, I'd like to introduce our two guests. First, Dr. Anton Chuvakin is a security advisor in the office of the CISO at Google Cloud, an organization that now includes Mandiant. Many of you know that, but maybe not everyone. You may remember Anton actually as an industry analyst at Gartner, where he worked for a number of years. He was a research vice president and a distinguished analyst there, and he covered a broad range of security topics. He's credited with inventing actually another highly influential term, which is EDR, endpoint detection and response. Before Gartner, Anton worked for a number of the earliest log management companies, and he also has a PhD in physics from Stony Brook, which is no easy feat to require.
So they say.
From what?
So they say.
So they say. Well, I definitely say it. Anyone who has a PhD in physics has jumped through some very, very difficult hoops. Our second guest is Jean Schaffer. Jean is my colleague and Corelight's Federal CTO. She bridges strategy at Corelight and mission requirements for US federal, Five Eye, and nation state markets. Jean is retired from the US intelligence community, where she worked for, I think, about 3 decades. Before her retirement, she was CISO and also Chief of Cyber and Enterprise Operations at the Defense Intelligence Agency. That's a really interesting organization. Not as many people know about it, perhaps as they should. You can Google it and learn more, but it's a very important part of the complex of intelligence agencies in the US. Before DIA, Jean was at the National Security Agency, where she held a series of executive roles in network operations, in what's called specialized IT, in computer network operations. She was also the authorizing official, which is a seemingly innocuous title with a lot of responsibility, and worked within the cybersecurity directorate. So the bottom line here is we have two really illustrious guests with quite different backgrounds, and we should have a good conversation. So let's get started. And I think, Anton, I will begin with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the how and the why of the origination of the term SOC Triad? What were you thinking when you coined the term, and what does the term mean?
Sure. So I usually would go back to my blog I've written at the time as my main memory aid, but unfortunately Gartner deleted some of the old blogs. Of course, I still have a copy because, you know, former system admin always have backups. So I did look at that copy of the original blog from August 2015. And what I was thinking at the time, as I recall now, is that a lot of security operations centers tended to double down on SIEM, on logs, and basically forget other types of visibility, which is not as critical. Right about the same time, EDR was coming up, at least the early signs of that. This was 2015. And I've kind of realized that the endpoint visibility pillar is a separate pillar. And then, of course, the good old network traffic visibility going back to 90s, if not the 80s, with TCP dump and the classic tools. I realized that all three have kind of a relationship as 3 pillars for visibility. I don't know why and how I equated to the nuclear triad, but I kind of, my mind somehow went to the submarines, land-based missiles and bombers as the nuclear triad, and I thought, oh, we have a sort of a SOC nuclear triad for the 3 pillars of visibility. Now, the model really did have staying power. I almost didn't expect that, because at the time it was just something to organize my thinking in the paper I was writing at the time. Funny enough, I think the paper was actually on network visibility. So that was the pillar that originally triggered me into that thinking. But what happened then later is I started referring to this, and I've noticed some vendors started to refer to this model, but ultimately its original purpose was to remind people that obsession with logs alone as SOC visibility, basically a SOC equated with a team that runs a SIEM, is kind of a mistake, because you do need to see traffic, you do need to see what happens on the endpoint beyond the logs. And then in 2020, I revisited the model, and the revisit has an interesting story as well, because I wanted to see if that model survived for 5 years. And I've noticed that I was almost motivated to add another pillar. If you look at the Medium blog that I've written in 2020, I kind of say that, well, to be really honest, I think Triad mostly survived, because no major new visibility pillar appeared, even though there are signs that there would be other candidates. And so I'm not going to do spoilers. We may show these candidates later today. But in 2020, I felt like the Triad mostly survived. I mean, admittedly, EDR became much more important. Network became maybe a tiny bit less important than logs, I don't know, but at the time, but that was my thinking at the time. Like, I didn't change anything, but I did ask a lot of painful questions about application visibility specifically. So it ended up being exactly that. Endpoint visibility, typically using EDR, network visibility, typically using what we call NDR, or even some people used to call IDS, or network forensics, and of course SIEM, which of course I'm going to cringe a tiny bit because you mixed SIEM with XDR, but yes, I agree that for this picture it's a fair comparison.
Okay.
So that's the backstory.
Thanks, Anton. And actually, I'm sort of curious how quickly the concept was adopted. Did you, I mean, you weren't really expecting it. It was just a way for you to organize that first blog post, you said. But then it must have caught on, and then you heard people repeating it. Did that surprise you?
No, because it was actually after the EDR situation. So I had not that I was already spoiled, but I suspected that it can happen. And sometimes it happens with not with the things that I felt analysts have big egos, right? Profound significance. Like, I've met other of my former colleagues whom coined dozens of acronyms, and some of them caught up, some of them didn't. CWPP, probably not many people know nowadays. What is CWPP? Right. Big deal. And I think the person who invented this, it had leverage and then sort of waned. I think that the Triad definitely felt like it had staying power, and so does EDR. For
sure. EDR may be the Uber acronym in our industry right now. But SOC Triad is a
there are definitely fun ones that, I mean, think about the CASB. A lot of people really criticize the 4-letter acronym creation, and then Gartner has tried to not do 4-letter acronyms. And of course, my original idea for EDR was ETDR for threats. And then people said, no, you don't need the T, Anton, just toss the T. But think about it. Now we have 5-letter acronyms like CNAP. Yes. Don't get me started on CNAP. I'm so happy this is not a CNAP webinar.
It's definitely not. But I had no idea there was downward pressure on acronym length at Gartner. So now we know. At the time, but apparently not anymore, because we're in 5 letters. Yeah, not anymore, exactly. Okay, over to Gene. You know, when we talked about how different your careers were, and you were working on important mission programs at NSA when Anton coined this term, and I'm sort of curious if it was a reasonable description of the security information architecture of, we know there's certain limits to what you can say, but of large government SOCs at the time the term was coined.
Yeah, so in 2015, I actually was still working at the National Security Agency. And I was in charge of all of their network infrastructure within their IT. And so, sorry, Anton, I had never heard of the SOC Triad till many years later. We really weren't tracking what Gartner was worried about because, as you know, NSA is kind of a primary target for adversaries across the world to try to, kind of try to break into us. But what we were focused on at the time is, yes, we did have network data. So we were looking right at the network data. We had set up DMZ zones. So we closely monitored the DMZ zones. We actually had EDR. We might not have called it EDR at that time, but we were looking at what was happening on those workstations. And a little bit unique from the government point of view is we were already trying to figure out pieces of data, right? So how are we going to label data? How are we going to protect data, right? And track that data to see whether or not that data was getting exfilled out to the internet and stuff. So we had many of the major components. I would say we went a little bit over and beyond from where the SOC Triad started, though.
Yeah, well, you shared a little more than I thought you might, Gene. So let's double click there. What kinds of, because the triad and the model exists within a culture and within a mission, within specific institutions. So what kind of risks were your teams most concerned about?
We absolutely were concerned about adversaries trying to break into our networks, but we were equally concerned about internal data and information exfilling out to the public internet also. So we kind of have that combination, and I think because of that, we probably were a little bit more advanced than some of the other corporations and stuff at that moment, because again, we already realized that it's the data that we're trying to protect. So we really had to figure out how to do that better.
Yeah. But it sounds like, though, this general idea of first order data sources being combined into some analytics platform held, even if the details are a little different.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So now let's move forward in time a little bit. And Anton, maybe you've touched on this a bit with the Medium post you mentioned. But I'm curious, in the past 10 years or so, what data sources you think have become more or less important, or in some cases there might be a curve, less important than more. What are some of the winners and losers in this space?
I mean, 10 years is a long time, so it's a bit of a tough question, right? So let me try to maybe slice it a little bit. Like, I felt like in the 10 years, we went through a dramatic rise of the endpoint importance. And I think one other of my former colleagues, I don't recall the name, so please don't hold it against me, but basically always used the pendulum model. He may have tracked it from the 90s or from some ancient times, when the security industry became obsessed with network, firewalls, traffic capture, network forensics, all sorts of fun ideas, and then suddenly things swing to endpoint. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the pendulum model because I don't think we had that many swings, but in the last few years, there was definitely a massive rise of EDR, and it was very obvious to me, again, still at Gartner at the time, that people started asking, oh, Anton, can we just ditch the SIEM in our SOC? And I'm like, what do you mean ditch the SIEM? Like, where would you look at logs? And they'd be like, well, I mean, to be honest, we look at logs not a lot because we mostly look at EDR. EDR is so good. It looks at all the machines. It looks at the systems with much more depth. And logs, we'll save them for just in case. And my initial reaction was really fight it. And then over time, I'm like, okay, I guess for your situation, I see where a very EDR-centric SOC is the right call. So my thinking very much went through, holy cow, just don't. And to, well, I guess that makes sense. And then I felt like we peaked, EDR peaked. I think EDR peaked is I don't know when exactly, but certainly in the recent years, because we started talking about, wait a second, router intrusions. EDR is completely useless. And the EDR fans would say, Well, actually, your data is not on a router, so when they hit your router, they would eventually have to land on an instrumented machine. And I had one argument, admittedly, it was a pretty rude and maybe even drunk argument at the Gartner Security Symposium about how this thinking is dangerous. And the EDR company founder was saying, no, it's fine, because ultimately they will land at the machine that we instrumented with EDR. So the debate ultimately never ended, but the EDR peaked, and that part is very clear, because we certainly look at, well, even the appearance of XDR implied that people weren't just entirely satisfied with deep, well-instrumented endpoint telemetry and nothing else. No, sorry guys. I think at this point it's very clear that it's a niche. It's again a niche situation. I also felt like the cloud arrival have really, what's the technical term, tweaked both EDR and NDR sides, because in a clean, beautiful, probably not existing in many places, cloud-native environment, traffic is all encrypted, end-to-end, point-to-point, everywhere, and endpoints aren't OS. Endpoints are either containers or microservices or something else. But the point is that there isn't an OS to stick an agent into. So I felt like cloud have boosted logs, boosted network a little bit, if not everything is encrypted, and also for encrypted traffic metadata, but definitely suppressed the traditional endpoint. Right now, things are happening at a pretty rapid pace. Of course, if companies are largely using software as a service, then the triad becomes just logs, right? Like nothing to sniff, nothing to instrument. So to me, this is why it's a little fuzzy. Like I don't have things are clearly going in that direction. One thing that would come up, I'm sure today, is that the application visibility, all those little vendors trying to do eBPF this and eBPF that, are trying to really look deep inside the app with moderate success. And to me, this is, and again, I'm doing a bit of a spoiler, this is probably the strongest contender for the fourth pillar of the, well, not triad anymore.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of what you said resonated with us, I think, or with me. Internally, we do have a pendulum slide at Corelight, and we've tracked, and you may or may not agree, but I'll share it with you actually afterwards, sort of 3 cycles through the endpoint to network extremism. And certainly a lot of network security companies for the past, say, 5 years might have felt they passed through some kind of valley of death with EDR extremism being on the rise. But I think the best evidence that that fever has broken a little bit was RSA again this year, and some of the documents that came out just before, the CrowdStrike threat report having long passages emphasizing the importance of a balanced view, and the attack patterns that you cited on network infrastructure and uninstrumentable infrastructure. And from the keynotes at RSI, lots of recognition of that pattern. So yeah, we're seeing the same thing here. Gene, I'm curious a little bit about data sources that have been useful in the intelligence community over time, and if that's evolved at all in the last 10 years. I know that you left the community a few years ago, but you still keep in touch. Have you seen any evolution in that pendulum? Whether there's a pendulum or not, I guess we can discuss, but any evolution in the importance of the different data sources?
Yeah, so of course you need the network data. Of course you need the data coming off of your endpoints. But again, when I sort of introduced where our agencies were in the intelligence community and we were focused on the protecting of data, there's a key element that I would eventually like to see and understand how it fits into the SOC infrastructure, and that's with identity, right? So sure, we could track the identity of the people from the endpoint as to who's logging on, right? That kind of stuff. And then you could track sort of the identity through the network to see what was happening and who was accessing it. I do agree with Anton that we were already looking at application, because it's really right layer 7 where your data is going to reside. So you need to be able to understand that. And then I think the big twist was when the cloud was introduced, right? All of a sudden you went from individual organizations or agencies not having full end-to-end coverage of all of their assets and what they were doing, and you were going to have to push some of that security off to the cloud provider itself. But again, identity becomes really much more even relevant within that infrastructure, within that cloud infrastructure, to be able to tie the identity through the whole thing. We have seen in the past couple of years, even like Microsoft had explained to us how they found one of the Chinese actors who had exploited, right, the identity services for the cloud, that were able to go back and get further identities through the agencies that were being supported on that cloud. So I see the pendulum switch as the SOC triad is absolutely your basis. I think we need to look well beyond that at this point, and actually move more toward application and identity, and how do we make sure we have that end-to-end when we're using the cloud providers.
Yeah, you both mentioned cloud now, so let's double click a little bit on cloud. And Jean, I'll start with you. I think given your background in the intelligence community and the reputation that the U.S. government has for SaaS aversion in some quarters, I think some of our viewers might be a little curious about how important cloud architectures are becoming in the federal context. And I'm sure the adoption is different across civilian defense and IC, but what are some of the key considerations and initiatives, just by way of background? How important is cloud becoming?
So cloud's important across all of the sectors of the government, right? The civilian and your unclassified portions of the government truly do use the Gov Cloud, right? The public clouds with additional security applied. And then within the intelligence community and in the DoD, those cloud providers actually have carved off and moved up to a different classification level. We call them the sovereign clouds that operate in those classified environments. So those are a little bit more difficult to have SaaS applications apply, because you're not just going to let all the vendors who's supporting the SaaS come onto those networks. But the concept of having to understand that cloud infrastructure, the architecture, how you protect it, and all of these other features are relevant across all of the domains of the government.
Okay, thanks for that background. So moving to you, Anton, I'm curious what you think the challenges and opportunities for doing India, for doing network detection and response, one of the few acronyms you didn't coin in cloud environments. And I will say we've grappled with this question ourselves, and our company and our whole industry is doing it. And I guess if the threats remained unsophisticated, then the thesis might be that very shallow network-derived data might be sufficient, flow data might be sufficient. But we're finding that among our customer base anyway, there's a yearning for deeper data, better analysis, and in part to feed analytics pipelines, including AI pipelines. Still, there are challenges in the cloud, and I'm curious what your view on that is.
I mean, one interesting side angle to look at this is, of course, vendors and companies that are trying to create a CDR, the cloud detection and response. And yeah. This is a sort of a somewhat separate agonizing challenge, because when you look at what people do, how people attempt to create CDR, of course, logs play a role, but it's very clear that the CDR is sort of like one of those Schrodinger markets, a market, but also not a market. I think one of my, virtual colleagues from Forrester pointed out that CDR should not be a technology segment, but CDR is the capability of other tools, which to me is a very nuanced take. Of course, many vendors would not hear it. They would assume CDR needs to be a market. So if cloud detection and response is a separate domain that requires its own ways to observe things that aren't reduced to network aren't reduced to endpoint sensing in the traditional way and aren't reduced to logs, then perhaps CDR is the fourth pillar, because we would need the endpoint visibility, cloud visibility, network visibility, and logs. On a good day, I am somewhat compassionate of that view. But on a bad day, I still feel like CDR isn't necessarily the fourth pillar, because the types of visibility that actually contribute to observing cloud, which aren't under the three, are probably application layer stuff. It's probably something that flows from inside complex application ecosystems, pieces of middleware talking to each other, whatever else. So I'm sort of on the fence a little bit, that because if I say, hey, this former analyst Anton created a visibility quad, endpoint, network, cloud, and logs, somebody would say, wait a second, one is not like the others. Cloud is this whole land that, of course, includes points communicating over the network. So wait a second, in the cloud, you can have virtual machines, which means you can have agents, which means you can have EDR. You also have network traffic encrypted usually, but sometimes not. So you can have traditional NDR, layer 7 visibility. Why are you adding this cloud thing? Because cloud is clearly another land where the three original pillars apply. And then the contrarian view would be like, wait a second, no, in the cloud, you also have unique visibility mechanisms. But so notice that this debate would be quite interesting, and it would be nuanced. It wouldn't be about obvious yes, obvious no. What is not debatable is that we do need the way to observe cloud effectively. And if you can't rely on agents, and if you can't sniff traffic and logs aren't enough, we do look at other mechanisms. But to me, they're kind of in the application land. So to me, the application observation, I mean, whether it's observability, BPF, or some other future mechanism, is a much stronger fourth pillar candidate. And it would also the pillar that would play much stronger in the cloud. So it's almost going to be like a stand-in for CDR.
Yeah, and that pillar, so we've now brainstormed a number of potential fourth pillars, and they're sitting here in, around us cognitively. There's identity, there's cloud, but your argument maybe is that's more of a context or an environment. eBPF is pretty interesting because it has this property of giving access to many different kinds of telemetry. It actually can be used to sniff network traffic. In fact, we use it for that purpose as one means of acquiring traffic in the cloud. And I wonder, is that a data source? Is it a very promising technology? It's not exactly a context. I want to like put a little pressure on the idea that it's a fourth pillar. What is it exactly?
Well, I actually wasn't thinking of eBPF as the fourth pillar. I was thinking of application visibility as a fourth pillar.
Acquired via eBPF.
Which is today in modern environments often achieved using eBPF. At least that's my impression. Because ultimately, if it's not logs and if it's not, taking screenshots of the app like some early CASB vendors did many years ago, it is probably some kind of a telemetry from inside the app. But you're right, of course, eBPF itself is probably not a great example. Ultimately, P stands for packet, right? And then it is a way to collect traffic as well as the more traditional OS telemetry. So yes, I think that it's more application visibility as a pillar, not eBPF as a pillar.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. It's probably clear to everyone, not to me. Another question I have is, to what extent this notion of SOC Triad is influenced greatly by the architectural context? Because you've already alluded to the fact that in extreme SaaS architectures, and there's probably other extreme architectures, microservices and others, the SOC Triad would have to evolve fairly radically in a different direction. Are you trying to preserve a kind of general SOC Triad notion that's applicable to a lot of architectures, cloud, on-prem, hybrid, multi-cloud?
This is a painful question, because one other throwaway comment I sometimes make when I present on other topics is that a lot of security problems, again, this is a very theoretical argument. Don't say, it's not practical, Anton, be quiet.
Yeah.
Like, the point is that if you throw away your IT and you use Chromebooks and SaaS, software as a service applications, and the access point is Chromebook, I mean, I don't know, maybe like 90 to 95% of security would be gone. like it would be solved. It wouldn't be solved. It would never appear. So in that sense, it's almost hard to argue against it. The only argument against it is that a random Belgian bank started in 1677, whose IT was started in maybe 1940s, cannot say, we're going to toss mainframes. We're just going to do SAS and Chromebooks. Like, sure, SAS and Chromebooks, quote unquote, fixes much of security. Not IAM, I get it, and not certain other types of threats, but it's would also very much reduce the opportunity for visibility, because if you're doing software as a service, then you're likely in some form of CASB or SAS posture assessment, SPM, but your visibility is very limited. Your security is smaller, but some of it is held up by paper, by contracts, right? By what you can tell the software service vendor to do on kind of for you. So I'm also torn that for this type of extreme modern environments, we may not have a SOC triad, and frankly, we may not have a SOC. Once, many years ago, I had an argument, actually another argument, which it didn't turn violent, but it was with one of my analyst colleagues. He basically brought up an argument that if I am a heavy software as a service user, my SIM is my CASB. And I thought, no, your SIM is a SIM, CASB is a CASB, they're not the same. But if all you have on the application/backend side is software as a service, your center point for visibility is indeed CASB. So many years later, I was like, yeah, he was kind of not entirely wrong, because if all you have is software as a service and thin clients, then CASB is your main, possibly only way to observe it.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Schrodinger market. This may be a Schrodinger architecture. I think all these extreme architectures are super interesting to think about in theory, but unlikely to be attainable within our lifetimes in practice at scale. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Startups, they are. I mean, the Chromebooks and SAS is not uncommon for a Bay Area startup.
Yeah, that's true. They have the great advantage of not having been founded in 1600. But yeah, you're right. Well, actually, in some ways, we're invoking the concept of zero trust here without naming it. And I wonder, Gene, if you could talk a little bit about zero trust goals in federal agencies and how you think, how that's unfolding, because that's sort of the polar opposite of a SaaS first startup, that was first funded 5 years ago. Like massive complexity, massive on-prem deployments and data centers. How is that journey going? And does it say anything about the way SOC Triad needs to evolve in government context?
Sure. So let's just review zero trust for the sake of the conversation we're going to have, right? So zero trust is all about assuming you're already breached on your network, right? And so this is about protecting the data and making the accurate access decisions to the data, right? Because again, that's what you're protecting in these large environments. So when you look at it in that point of view, the true zero trust advocates would say your network data becomes less important because, right, you're already assuming that breach. What I would tell you is your network data is important, not from I'm gonna protect a perimeter and then, right, just trust everything on the inside, but your network data is what's gonna give you the complete story and the context so you can see and actually understand whether or not everything you're applying to protect that data, the access control, the who's accessing it, and everything else, it is actually doing what you think it is doing. Because unfortunately, I've run too many infrastructures. I know you can have a wonderful, well-architected, on a piece of paper, meet every requirement possible. But then when you actually start implementing that, you make tweaks, and no one's actually looking at those tweaks you're making as you're doing this deployment to understand what holes you're actually opening up, right? So so I believe the SOC triad is still valid in that zero trust architecture, but you just have to think about the data perhaps in a different way for zero trust. You still care about the endpoint. You really still care about your identity, right? Because that's really crucial when you're doing the access to the data. And you do care about your network because it's that network that's going to complete the rest of your zero trust architecture so you can understand what's happening.
Yeah, it seems like if you really take this idea of assuming breach seriously, you cannot assume breach in certain areas and not others of your environment. And so when you combine that with the very human pattern you described, Gene, and I've run networks too, it's sort of like entropy. Here's another physics term, Anton, I'm going to misuse it, but it's sort of like architectural entropy. It starts out beautifully designed in Visio diagrams, and then inevitably and sort of almost corrosively, that perfection degrades over time. And so to me, zero trust does imply the need for assurance and the need for backup. But I don't know that everyone is on board with that notion.
Yeah, everybody's not on board with that notion, I don't believe. But in my experience, that's where I think we truly need to be so that we can implement zero trust with all the factors that it is actually meant to be implemented with.
Yeah. And so we've mentioned, I'm going to pull out another thing that we've alluded to a couple of times, but haven't really dug into, and that's encryption. And yeah, I think Anton mentioned it first. And Gina, I'd like to ask you a bit about the relevance or the impact of encryption on that architecture we've just been describing. So it seems like the use of encryption can sort of, it cuts both ways. And obviously it helps assure privacy, confidentiality. It makes defensibility a lot more difficult. And I'm wondering if you think NDR is, do we just throw up our hands and abandon NDR in the face of encryption, or are there still things we can do?
Oh, that's a rhetorical question. Of course you do.
It's a softball.
That's a pretty softball. Sure. I mean, everything is better when it's encrypted, whether it's encrypted at rest, encrypted in transit, right? You want to protect as much as possible. But that doesn't mean there's not value in that encrypted traffic, right? You don't need to understand what the payload is to be able to get the goodness that's coming out of the encrypted packets that flow around it, whether it's understanding the crypto and what you're using, whether it's truly making sure that it is encrypted and it's not flowing in the clear when you presume it's encrypted, whether or not it's using the right algorithms, whether or not right, just all of that information that you get from that metadata surrounding the actual encrypted payload is valuable information that'll help any analyst put together what's happening, whether there's an intrusion, what should they go investigate, all of that information. It just is still very valuable information to give you the complete picture so you don't go off kind of half-cocked with information in the wrong direction and not find what you're really looking for.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And before I give Anton a chance to reflect on encryption, I want to remind those of you watching live to type in any questions you have about this topic. So I don't think we have any yet in the panel. I'd love to see some come in because we'll move to questions in about 10 minutes or so. So Anton, same question to you really. We've definitely seen a rise in encryption. It's our data, because we've done some analysis of it, suggests that rise has sort of peaked, and there's still a fair amount of unencrypted data in networks that's largely unintentional, but again, it's an example of that architectural entropy that I described. What do you think the impact of encryption is for NDR and implicitly on the SOC triad as well?
So I do recall one of the last things I've done at Gartner in 2019 was kind of trying to update some of the network security detection response papers. And this was, I think, one of the last blogs I've written is trying to understand how apocalyptic is encryption on the network observation. And I think that ultimately, I don't have that log in front of me, but ultimately my take was that it's not apocalyptic, but it obviously reduces the percentage and the amount of layer 7 stuff you can see by a wide margin, and a lot of value is in layer 7. I've spoken to all of the vendors, probably including yourself at the time, as far as all the magic tricks and cool technology that can be used to analyze encrypted data, and I was super impressed by what you've done, by what some others have done, and I thought that's beyond what I expected. But this being beyond what I expected is far short of just reading the layer 7 data. so in that sense, I think that the encryption does suppress the network visibility pillar, and I don't have any data as to whether encryption has peaked. And again, in my Gartner days, we were really curious about the east-west traffic encryption at normal companies. And at this point, I don't know. I don't have the data. I don't know who have the data. I would think you would have the data as to whether what the percentages are at different types of companies and whether they're growing. I think you just alluded that the internal traffic encryption is not growing. I am not shocked, because there are enough people who don't see a way to justify the cost. Cost is lower now because, of course, hardware is more efficient and there are many ways to encrypt. Google probably has some research on that because we encrypt all of that, right? So I think that if we magically end up in the world where most of the internal data is encrypted, we will go back to the 80s in terms of traffic analysis with just metadata. And again, some cool techniques on top of that. But sure, I'm not going to allude to a person who was at NSA before that, who talks to whom is important. And of course, who talks to whom is important. And the volume and the frequency and the time of the day is important. But can't I just go and read the packets like in the 90s? Like what I'm saying is that, sure, it's still possible, but we have to make kind of like sound mildly defensive arguments about relevance of this. There is relevance, but there's probably less compared to reading the unencrypted data.
Yeah,
what I do think is the man in the middle, person in the middle stuff is going to shrink. That part is just my impression. And again, from late Gartner days, is that it was just thoroughly hated by most everybody. And so, if I am not an expert and my data is a little stale, but my impression is that we'll just break it and insert a sniffer. I don't think that's a thing for the future. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's going to die.
We see some of our customers doing it more often. What they do, rather than man in the middle, is just terminate SSL for layer 7 load balancing, and that is a really great architectural point for collecting.
It's kind of the same now, right?
It is kind of the same, but I think modern Kubernetes scalable web services really demand load balancing at layer 7. So that is an interesting architectural access point for unencrypted traffic.
But if you do it with card data, credit card data, you're in the world of hurt with PCI. You're technically in violation, and all sorts of other things would. That you would do that.
I have to say, we see some organizations passionately committed, but not a large number. And and I also don't want to suggest that there isn't massive amounts of encrypted data within enterprises. There is. It's just that it's not 100%. And there's still one very common scenario for us when we go into maybe a new proof of value engagement with a customer is that we discover plenty of unintentionally unencrypted traffic. And so that sort of layer of assurance that network traffic analysis and NDR can provide is still quite valuable. Another trend before we get to questions, and because I want to ask you ultimately, Anton, if you are ready to revise, and you may not be yet, but are you ready to revise the notion of SOC Triad? But it occurs to be another sort of hidden trend here that we haven't explicitly discussed is the fact that these data sources are actually blurring into each other a little bit. Like in the case of encrypted traffic in the cloud or cloud traffic generally, one of the things we're doing, and other vendors are too, is just combining traditionally endpoint derived data with network data, sometimes with identity data, maybe with contextual data from Kubernetes or from VPC context into a kind of hybrid log. It starts as a network log, but it attaches human identity and maybe VPC context or Kubernetes context, and we get something new that hasn't really existed before. I wonder if you see that as an interesting trend, that the streams are merging a little bit.
Let me address the kind of the fusion slash correlation argument, and then the potential fourth pillar. So
Good.
I feel like if you can do more with the same data sources, essentially the triad was always about collection sources and not about what type of brain you add. So for example, in 2010, you would have rule-based correlation, but in 2016, you'd have some kind of ML-based technology, but on the same three sources. So ultimately, I think the latest iteration that Gartner published of the triad, which was in 2019, had UBA, which means analytics based on ML, on the same triad, but of course in a SIM box. But ultimately, UBA and ML type of tech can be applied to endpoint data, and many EDR vendors do it right on EDR. A lot of people, including yourself, apply ML to network traffic. And of course, there are all sorts of interesting cross correlations. I feel like cross correlations are underexploited. You are right. That type of some kind of a fusion between what I see on the endpoint. I don't recall who was doing this, but somebody was connecting traffic outside of the firewall to traffic inside to a process on a machine. There's a lot of cool things you can do. And some of this also allows the endpoint plus network to sort of overpower the logs. I don't need detailed login if I can really apply that extra layer of analytics to endpoint and network. And I've seen some people do that with success. And I think you partner with EDRs, and then there's cross correlation across two products where the EDR reports this process did something weird, but you report some type of connectivity elsewhere in the network that may be related to that. So to me, this to me is also sort of assumed that the analytical layer on top of the three pillars would be better over time, whether we have Gen AI now to look at some raw command lines, actually. That was really quite cool that you look at command lines and you can Gen AI some fun stuff out of it. So, and then possibly link it to network data. So this part is, I'm sort of remain a big fan, but also if something's not in the data, it may not just be in the data. If it's an obscure application that sits outside of your control, you have no traffic or endpoint data. There's nothing to correlate. So that brings me to the fourth pillar. As a result of this webinar, I'll probably finish my blog, which is kind of refreshes the triad. And deep in my heart, this is what, July 10th when we are airing this. I'm not sure whether I would just say, hey, this is Anton's SOC Visibility Quad, and the fourth pillar is application. I'm honestly not sure. I think that I'm skewed by arguments in favor a lot more than I was. But what I'm afraid of a little bit is, sorry for turning this into psychoanalysis session, is that if we're not talking about eBPF, application visibility is kind of vague. If I say endpoint, you think EDR, you think logs from a leading EDR vendors, you think Sysmon. If I say network, you think layer 3 captures, metadata, layer 7. The picture is immediate. But try telling an average security analyst, hey, application traces. What kind of picture would come up in his head, her head? I don't know. It's possible that no picture would come up. So that's why my incorrect equation of application visibility with eBPF is an example of the same exact thing. Like I need something to say, well, to monitor this using this fourth pillar of the quad, you need to do X. But what is that X? If X depends on every application, if it involves things that ultimately end up being mythical, like RASP, real-time application self-protection or something, the acronym that was created at Gartner and died very rapidly, that's my fear against pushing for application as the fourth pillar. It's like, what would we tell people in terms of actionable advice? Any help?
Well, I think you could be misunderstood as you were by me, and like half an hour ago. And I also think maybe there might be counter pressure to say, well, you could subsume that into the concept of logs. It's another source of logs, maybe a different format. So you might have reductionists arguing against that.
I still want to know.
We have advice. What's that, Kate?
I want to know why Anton doesn't want to talk about identity.
Okay, good. Let's do this. Let's do more psychoanalysis. Why is Anton in denial of identity? So there's the initial story goes like this. When I was at Gartner, we had a security team of analysts who did security research. And what a surprise, we had an identity team. And it is, I would assume that most people would think that identity management, IAM, is part of security. But it really wasn't historically. And there's a long historical argument that hides somewhere in probably in the 2000s as far as why Gartner had two teams. So I always assume that identity is and isn't part of security, because there are obviously many reasons for identity management that aren't only about blocking access. So as of today, I obviously live at a cloud provider, and I realize that the dramatic importance of IAM and identity and federated identity and how most breaches or many breaches involve identity. But in my mind, at least most of the analysis of these activities are log-based. And I made 10 arguments why identity is a yes, but I think one argument is that, okay, how do I observe all these identity activities? Well, that's actually logs, right? So you would need to have different types of logs. You may need to look at browser logs. You may need to look at logs from your, what do we call them, a SASE, zero trust kind of layer. But identity goings or IDP, identity provider logs, how much fun was found in Okta logs. You all know that Okta logs are really fun to read. I suggest you do that before your bedtime. You would never sleep. So the point is that while I've grown to value identity hugely, I still feel like the identity detection and response is mostly logs. Hence my hesitation to say identity needs to be a pillar.
It's a little like my counter argument to the application pillar.
Correct. It's a little bit like that. But I think that at least several people have tried to argue with me about that with moderate success. So some of you know, I also run this podcast for Google Cloud. And in a few weeks, I don't recall exactly when, we'll have an episode where somebody makes a very strong case that ITDR is not a SIEM that looks at identity data. So if you think that ITDR, identity threat detection and response, is a thing, and it isn't just a module for SIEM, then they may have a stronger argument that identity is a separate visibility pillar, not network, not endpoint, and not logs.
Yeah. I'm passing my eye to the. Okay. Thank you. I'm taking a look at the clock. We have about 5 minutes left and questions. We got a question in, but I think we may have covered already about the declining appeal of man-in-the-middle techniques. So let me know if everyone is watching live. Please type your questions in. And I might, Anton, it occurs to me you're right at the epicenter of the application of LLMs to security. I know it's not part of your day job, but it's got to be part of the water you swim in. And I'm curious if Gemini and similar developments have any applicability for this architectural model in your mind, or if it's just if it becomes a necessary and maybe even critical feature of the data analysis, what we might call the SIEM.
I think there are two things, like 1.5 things. One thing is kind of what you're describing. A lot of this, the richer the data you collect, the more likely that LLM type tech would be useful. Like if you look at social media, there are a lot of people who are sort of excited about LLM in logs, but there are also people who tried this and they realized that, yeah, you know what, logs really aren't language, and what we are getting with LLMs is kind of like high cost, kind of like a high cost medium value at best. So we're probably not going to be LLM in raw logs. But there is a lot of stuff around it, like context and enrichment, where the new analysis techniques are quite handy. So where the cost is maybe medium and the value is medium or high, because in finding a high cost medium value use case is not that great, unless you are somebody who would need this result at any cost, which of course these exist. Like would be cases where I need the result, I don't care about the cost.
Yeah. We've actually, because the LLMs have been trained on Broseek data and Suricata data, we have found a few low-cost, high-value use cases, Anton, and they're extremely high value, and they just benefit from the decades of public domain training material. But we can't yet ask, without hallucination and misdirection, what do these Zeek or Suricata or Brolog say about what's happening. We can't ask an open-ended question without lots of prompt engineering and always get a rational answer.
But if you give the answer to a human, you may still save the day. Like what I'm trying to say is the classic high false positive, low volume symptom, right? If your system produces 10 alerts, 9 of them are false, but the 10th one saves your bacon, but there are only 10, not 10 millions, then it's a good system. And that's what I had this shift back in the Yuba days when somebody said, I love this system. And I said, what about the false positive? And they said, yeah, about 90% are false. And I was like, what? And they were like, well, we tuned it down to a small number of signals, and this small non-false positive signal saves our bacon every time. And I thought, oh, okay, yes, given low volume, I buy your argument. And so if something of that sort can be done, then the high value would be high value and the noise would be manageable, right?
Yeah, we obsess about, I mean, low volume false positives are actually much rarer than high volume false positives. High volume false positives.
Low volume of false signal. Like
yeah,
absolutely. 90% false, but there are only 10 signals rather than 10 million.
Jean, do you want to get a word in here before we go to a question that came in?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. In lightning round mode, one of our viewers proposes a non-functional fourth pillar. So maybe just a purely architectural pillar. That's interesting. Security requirements management during procurement processes that align to business security and risk appetite. So maybe they're suggesting there's a context around the architecture. Depends on what you're buying and securing. What do you think about that, Anton?
I think that the triad model have absolutely not touched on the context. And I think that the context exists outside of that. Like, for example, if I have the endpoint visibility using EDR, but my EDR is on a virtual machine in GCP, context is very different. And this machine is a client PC in my hands that I use for 2 years versus on a VM that lives for 10 minutes in the cloud, it's still E. It's still E from EDR, but the context is completely different. The timing, the timeline, the value, the role, what it does, what it connects to, where it lives, pretty much all context is outside of the triad. To me, that a lot of this matters quite a bit, but it isn't the primary pillar for what the data flowing into SOC.
Yeah. Context is necessary, but it's not part of the model.
Yes, correct. Context changes a lot more, and that's why cloud befuddles so many pre-cloud SOCs, because they sort of say, "Oh yeah, we're just gonna get CloudTrail logs into our Splunk," and it's like, okay, and now you are $1 million poorer. What else did you do?
Cloud befuddles pre-cloud SOCs. That's a good, just file that away for one of your podcasts or.
I think I have a whole slide deck.
Okay, well, that's excellent.
Last year, funny enough, when we sort of almost met with Jim.
Hey, that was super fun. Our time has actually come to an end, but I want to thank both of you for your participation. Great questions from the audience. A big thank you to Anton and Jean. And thank you to Corelight and to Google Cloud for co-sponsoring. I want to remind you that all attendees will receive a link to the recording pretty shortly. And if you're interested in learning more, please visit our websites, corelight.com, cloud.google.com. You should like and subscribe to Anton's podcast, and definitely look forward to a revision of the SOC Triad blog, which sounds like is in gestation. So I look forward to reading that, Anton. Such a pleasure to talk to you both. We'll be signing off for now, but hope to see you in person very soon. Take care, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you.